Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bassam Haddad, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Mohammed El-Kurd, who will be addressing our series on Israel's Endgame. We're still not 100% sure what this title means. We're exploring it as we go along, but it does refer to the question, where is Israel headed after this genocide, and questions surrounding it, not least in relation to the United States. And we are here both actually in the United States. Muhammad, before I read your bio or a part of it, how are you?
I'm good. يعطيك العافية. And it's a pleasure to be here with you, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. Thank you for having me.
Allah yafik. We have been watching you for a long time. I know we had one event together in the past couple of years at George Mason University, in person,
Yes, yes,
at a panel with Jihad Abu Salim and Noura, and
yes.
it was really remarkable. And I have been saving you, if you will, to a conversation of this sort, given that you have actually had lived in Palestine and now you are in the United States, and your journey and the story of your trip. And if you would like to discuss, even if briefly, the situation with your actual residence, your home, is actually very intriguing. A home that I actually went to
Yeah,
uh, more than 10 years ago, and I met your family.
yeah.
So let me just say that a couple words about Muhammad. Muhammad is a writer, poet, journalist, and organizer from Jerusalem, occupied Palestine. He is the nation's first ever Palestinian correspondent and editor at large at Mondo Weiss, the recipient of numerous honors and awards, and the author of the highly acclaimed poetry collection Rifqa, which has been translated into several languages. The longer bio will actually be posted on Jadaliya, where you can learn a little bit more about Muhammad. But I'm hoping that you can share with us before we start, Muhammad, a little bit about your background and your journey, uh, because it is relevant to our discussion in terms of your intimate connection to Palestine and living under the occupation for a long period of time.
Yeah, certainly. I think yani, it's in a lot of ways the story of my home and my family and my neighborhood is just as common as it is absurd, because prior to October 7th and for the larger larger span of Israel's lifetime, we have been on the receiving end of various forms of displacement and dispossession, and they get more bizarre, by the year. And in the case of my family, in the case of the larger neighborhood in occupied Jerusalem, our homes were targeted by American Jewish charitable organizations, actually, tax exempt organizations that are registered here in New York City, with the claim that our house is theirs by divine decree. And obviously, the court system is run by settlers, is built for settlers, and the military is as complicit. And so these forces came together to expel us from our home in the year 2009, and we have since shared our house. Half of our house is actually taken over by a Jewish American settler from Long Island City. And as absurd as that sounds, it's actually the reality in a lot of Jerusalem neighborhoods, be they Isawiyah or Silwan or other places in Sheikh Jarrah. And our lives, like our neighbors, continues to hang in the balance. And there's a lot to be said, yani, about this in terms of like psychological warfare one goes through sharing their house with settlers, the economic restraints that the court system demands, the kind of political futurelessness you experience, uh, being subjected to such horrible powerlessness, and so on. But what is hard to deal with is that despite the magnitude of such an atrocity, it seems to be dwarfed by what is going on in the Gaza Strip. And that has kind of put the troubles of people in the West Bank and occupied Jerusalem kind of on the back burner. We're seeing more and more systemic, organized, government backed settler pogroms in neighborhoods in the West Bank. We're seeing more and more Palestinian homes being demolished in Sinwan and the likes. And yet this ceases to make international news because it's just business as usual.
Thanks, Muhammad. As you have been witnessing this genocide for the past 2 years, and it's not stopping. I mean, very few of us, even the most cynical, and I know a lot of people who are cynical on the side of I guess humanity, who still did not consider that this will go on for so long. When we even when we heard Netanyahu and his other colleagues in the within the Israeli state say these like literally unbelievable things about Palestinians being animals and need to be treated as such, where everything needs to be cut off and so on. And when they uttered the word the words, this will take at least months. We almost didn't believe it because Gaza is yani is very small, and one wondered what is it that is going to happen more than, for instance, what happened in 2014 and other mowing the lawn years and operations. So, in this particular case, can you tell us how, before we get into the discussion of where is Israel headed, can you tell us how did you experience this these developments, the genocide, compared to previous uh, operations, cast lead and what have you?
Yeah.
Uh, I would like to hear this from your perspective, given that you lived there during some of these previous operations. Nonetheless, you lived in Jerusalem, not in
Yeah.
Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, the various wars on Gaza, the various assaults on Gaza have really shaped my political perspective and have really shaped my outlook on the world because it was happening in conjunction with our houses being taken and the solution that was provided for our houses being taken, or the kind of the approach we have used then around 2009 2010 is nonviolent civil protests and whatnot, and that gives you, you get some kind of a naive hope that that is a path forward. And then the wars on Gaza absolutely demolish that naivete. But like you said, it was extremely shocking that it's gone on for that long, and I think I hesitate to kind of complain or say anything publicly, but it's created such an inertia because it it seemed as though, and I know this is not true, and I know that in the course of history it's not true, but it seemed as though our efforts are futile. It seemed as though like what we do as like knowledge producers or as journalists or as people who are organizing this campaign or that campaign is these are all like fruitless efforts. Obviously, again, I know that that isn't true, but it wildly it forces you to kind of wildly reassess your approaches and your tactics. And if anyone was under the pretense that this is a war that would end, or this is an atrocity that would end as soon as the consciousness was raised, I think that pretense has been shattered since, because the world knows what has gone on in Gaza and what continues to go on in Gaza, and yet the world does not move, at least not in the scale that it should be moving.
I would like to begin addressing the theme of the current conversation, and I'd like to start by a very basic question on whether Israel, or whether you think that Israel and Israelis, especially those who are decision makers, if they believe it can or they can pursue policies of dispossession, apartheid, military occupation, and terror, and a slow motion genocide, even after this genocide, continues to subside for literally ever. Is this something that you think is on their minds? I actually worked on a film in 2005 and 2006 where we asked people for this documentary, uh, and people, in Palestine 48, and they human beings, regular ordinary people, many of them were not sure that they will be there forever. I mean, that was
Yeah,
the sense I got from. I mean, it's not a scientific poll, but a large number of basic
yeah.
interviews. What's your sense?
Yani, I grew up hearing my dad saying that their days are numbered. Hearing my father say is إنهم مش مطولين وهاي آخر أيامهم وما إلى ذلك, and then the decades go by. So it's hard to say. I think most people have that sense, myself included, that this is not going to be a permanent reality, because we understand just from looking at history that every empire ceases to exist at some point or transforms at some point. Um, and mutates. And I think this is ultimately the kind of fate of the Israeli empire. But it's hard to say. I'm quite conflicted looking at Israeli policy makers right now and looking at the policy that's being introduced. Um, I think they are operating with the will um, of someone who is drunk on power and someone who has been told repeatedly by the world that there are not going to be consequences for their actions. I think they're operating in this capacity where they think they can finish the job, and they tried to finish the job in Gaza and they were unable to. But they think they truly believe that there is a world in which they can uh, win, or they can fully finish the genocide. But at the same time, I think, Netanyahu and his peers, and the people in Israeli politics, I think they are politically astute at the same time, and I think they're able to read the room, and they're able to know that the heightened, hateful, bigoted rhetoric is not as accepted as it was. They're also able to understand that the platitudes and the kind of um, wholesale shining of Israel's image, saying, this is the most moral army in the world, and whatnot. These things don't pass anymore, and I think they're aware that they have to adapt to an increasingly changing world. But it's hard to say, because when you dehumanize your opponent so much, there is an ability, there is a way for you to be so deluded and like almost in a kind of mass hysteria or mass psychosis, where you're seeing what you're doing as not only righteous, but as um, something that you could actually get away with and finish.
Uh, do you see a difference between decision makers, which is what my like the thrust of my question is at the Israeli decision makers, people in power or people who are close to power? Do you see a distinction between decision makers slash politicians and the public on this question? And if you can give us your answer based on a comparative longitudinal spectrum. In other words, how whether it was different earlier, like 10 or 15, 20 years ago, and whether you think this has changed today, because during times of crisis and violence and wars and so on, usually the populace align more, even more in the case of Israel, because they did align generally with the government, even if they dislike or disapprove of the
Yeah.
ruling party. So how did this first? Is there a distinction, and whether that distinction is different today in general compared to a while back?
Yeah, I think the Israeli society has always been characterized by a genocidal outlook, and I think this has been always emboldened and fueled by the Israeli policymakers and Israeli decision makers. But we're talking about a population of people that is so coddled and so sheltered and so the media in Israel is so, surgically curated to fit a specific narrative of the utter need to have a perpetual warrior stance, and the belief in a perpetual victim complex that creates this paranoia and fear in Israeli uh, public. And they are, I think, a very aggressive few million people. Their instincts are always to kill, and always genocidal. I do think that Israeli policymakers are a bit more sober and are a bit more aware of what they're doing. But I think Zionism at large is not just Israeli politics, but Zionism at large, even in the United States and parts of Europe, is an industry of fear, and it thrives on that fear. And I think they know the kind of fear they're engineering, and the kind of fear that is necessary to maintain this perpetual warrior stance that I just mentioned. And the the public has to be in a state of panic at all times in order for the project to be achieved. Now, anecdotally, I think 15 years ago I could talk back to a soldier. I think 15 years ago I could yell at a settler. I think today, they're a lot more trigger happy, and it's a lot more risky to uh, to do something. I think they're operating outside of the law. I mean, they've always been a lawless place in terms of international law, but now they're disregarding their own laws. Everything is happening in violation of what they say they uphold as their ethics of free speech and whatnot. And the boot yani, is coming down a lot more aggressively than it has in the past. And I think this is not just because of the trauma they have kind of dealt with after October 7th. But I think this is because I can trace back the roots of this to the Unity Uprising in 2021, when they saw for the first time in many decades the Palestinian people from all shades and all legal statuses come together in protest, and come together and be unified. And we saw that the Palestinians with Israeli citizenship in Akka and Yafa and places like this, who protested against dispossession in Jerusalem, were then served extremely hefty, unheard of sentences. And there are people, young men, who are serving 15 and 16 and 18 years in prison for protesting in 2021. So I think this kind of this shift, I would trace it back to then. But I'm also, I'm young, and I haven't experienced the kind of security mania that has followed the first Intifada, or I'm not like extremely reminiscent of it right now. I don't remember how insane they became after the first Intifada or the second Intifada, or whatnot. But it just seems that after every uprising, they tend to tighten the noose.
Before I go back to the distinction question, you said something about when you were in Palestine, and if you can give us some dates or a range, you were able to speak back to settlers, and you feel that now it's different, and we have been seeing uh, literally horrendous footage of what settlers are doing to intimidate. And I do remember 1987, 88, and the first Intifada. And we were actually protesting at George Mason University when I was an undergrad. Uh, was a
Well,
very different world. And then, of course, the second Intifada, same thing. And we were protesting at the time in Washington, on Washington streets and so on, especially as Netanyahu was shuttling with others back and forth. Um, and of course, settlers, like, it's a very special category. I mean, whether there is or there isn't a God, settlers in Palestine, and based on my own experience going to Palestine, are a very special category. Not least the ones that we continue seeing wantonly for no reason at all destroy crops or burn crops or beat down an old man trying to tend to his olive trees and so on. These images do not end, or spoil water wells. I mean, it's the sort of sadistic thing that you see in movies, and it's actually not just individual behavior. It's a collectivity, or I should say actually, it's recurring, and it's very common. It's not just like an outlier behavior. So can you tell us more about what you just said a little while ago, that you could talk back, but now you don't think that's the case? Well, why is that? What
Yeah,
happened?
I mean, I think they have instilled this belief in if they give us any kind of inch of breathing room, that we will seize that breathing room to attack them, and maybe that's true. But I remember, مثلا, in 2009, 2010, we would get in active altercations with the Israeli police, with the Israeli military. Even like in 2018, 2016, we would be protesting in the street. I could be crossing Qalandia from Ramallah to Jerusalem, or crossing Gilo from Bethlehem to Jerusalem, and I could talk back to the soldier, or I could say something to him, or I could um, be almost aggressive, and that would be swallowed by them. And today, that absolutely does not exist, Yani. I mean, not to say that they haven't throughout the years, accuse people of like planning stabbing attacks, and planting knives next to them, and acting on a specific whim. But this, I think, now this kind of trigger happy attitude is characteristic of the entire nation, not just a large swath of it. And I think what you said earlier about the settlers, this is truly in the DNA of the state. The settlers, there's been a concerted effort to kind of separate the good settlers from the bad settlers, as if that's a thing. But it's this this violence and this bloodshed and this kind of incremental genocide through the passage of decades is intrinsic to the Israeli state, and has always been. But I think one point, and I could be wrong, but I think what I've been thinking about lately, and maybe people would disagree with this, is that when they're poisoning wells, or when they're beating down elderly, or when they're bombing and slaughtering children, I think they believe that they are righteous. They have, and I sometimes people get offended when I use the word psychosis, because it's as though I'm like stigmatizing mental illnesses. But I do truly believe that they have dehumanized us so much that they have reached a level of mass hysteria and psychosis. They believe in all of their states, despite the nuclear weapons, despite the diplomatic cover, despite the privilege and access and status that they have been able to achieve throughout the world. I think Zionists believe that a second Holocaust is always afoot. Maybe not the leaders, and maybe not the policymakers, but the everyday individual certainly believes, despite all of their status and protection, and from their high-rise apartment, they believe that their life is on the line, and this is why they're operating in that way. And I don't say this to excuse the violence. I say this because I think us coddling these fears, these like largely Jewish fears of a second Holocaust, or of a quote unquote anti-Semitism on the rise, coddling these things, or making or leaving any room for these debates, is only worsening the problem in which they believe they exist in an increasingly hostile world, and that their lives are on the line. And I think we have to respond to these baseless accusations, these baseless statistics. We have to respond with a really like tight commitment to the truth, because it's. I think they're acting out of a psychotic fear. I'm not saying this to like make light of anyone's troubles with mental health. I mean, myself included.
No, thank you for being so candid. But and you said it. There is this sort of prevailing feeling, and I've actually addressed this with people who are critics of the Israeli state, but who had lived in Israel proper, and this is almost a norm. It's sort of a hanging thought which can be easily mobilized, instrumentalized, and even manipulated to justify untold barbarism that the Israeli state is committing. In other
100.
words, and I've learned this from an Egyptian uh, economist, actually, Jalal Amin, in an interview where he said it really helps when you are oppressing somebody, or you're oppressing a people, or when you're like invading a country. At the time he was talking about the US invasion of Iraq, it really helps to recall the distinction that you have between you and them. It really helps to consider your fears. It really helps to consider the barbarism of the other, because what you're doing, no matter how problematic a people can be in their beliefs, it they still are human in the end, and they do need that sort of catalog of justifications to keep doing what they're doing. So I no, I totally hear what you're saying, and I'm not sure. I don't know who would think it's an affront, despite the fact that there are incidents of like real anti-Semitism and real hatred for the Jews. The problem with this discourse is that so much of this discourse that is problematic and anti-Semitic and so on is not coming from the people that are calling for equal rights in Palestine and Israel. I mean, that's the whole in Palestine, and calling for, let's say, a one state solution. The whole idea behind it is the insistence on equality, not the other way around. And now we are seeing in the United States, which is something I'll come back to, really bold claims that are, can be described as nothing other than anti-Semitic. But this is not the movement. These are coming from certain voices, which have always repeated this discourse. So
Yeah.
let me move to the back to the question of distinction before we actually before I ask you about uh, Israeli society. So you were saying that that the people in many cases are a bit more quote unquote, or can be, or groups within Israeli society can be more extreme than the state, because the state and state officials have to make considerations that a lot of people don't. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit? Because Allah yabashrak bil khair, as we say in Arabic, yani. So the state is actually prudent in relation to some of the groups, and
يعني
and
basically.
yeah, let's not address the most extreme parts of Israeli society, those who, I mean, which is a like a which exists, but in general, like the broader public, um, let's address that to an extent.
I am of the mind, and I wouldn't say that the Israeli state is prudent, but I think Israeli society at large is a lot more irrational and a lot more emotion driven than the state. And I think Netanyahu does care about where the world might head, and he is quite calculated, and so is the rest of the Israeli government. I think with the Israeli public, it is within the DNA of the state. It's within the mythology, the self mythologizing of the population, that they are genocidal, and you see this in the art they make. You see this in the songs they celebrate too. You see this but also, even if rhetoric and genocidal rhetoric was put to bed, and I do anticipate and I do expect, it would be put to bed in the coming years, even if no one uttered a word of genocidal speech, the way that the state is built is inherently genocidal. The fact that you do not build your villages except on hilltops because you want to see everything that's around you is inherently um, feeding a genocidal tendency. The fact that you have built your national character as a refusal of once being a victimized or a marginalized group in the world, and now you have to be a strong man and you have to be the toughest guy. That is inherently, it feeds a genocidal impulse. The fact that you have to surveil every single aspect of our senior people's lives in order to feel secure, in order to have a sense of safety, that is inherently genocidal. And so, even the most peace loving, in my opinion, of Israelis still have that kind of racist impulse of feeling insecure around Arabs and insecure around Palestinians. And the response and the remedy to that fear oftentimes is genocide, maybe in a more incremental way, maybe in a one house after the other, one house after the other. But yeah, uh, it's certainly prevalent. Maybe sure, maybe there's like 10-20% of Israeli society who's a little bit more healthy. But I think they're they have in the past 2 years they have allowed us to kind of caricaturize them, and they have allowed us. There was this kind of thing going on online about, like, if you want to learn the truth about Israel, just hit translate on a Hebrew tweet. It's not that people are digging in the mud and digging in like deep dark corners of the internet to find examples of Israelis being absolutely insane. It's that this is the norm and this is the mainstream, and so the examples are abundant, and so the Israeli ambassador can go and complain about artwork made by Palestinian children in the UN, and call it anti-Semitic, or a risk. Yeah, because these things are supported by the public. If the public oppose these things, then he would feel and look crazy doing it. Maybe I'm a bit more cynical here.
No,
I
no,
do
but no.
believe.
On the contrary, you actually left out. But by the way, my role here, I'm not a journalist. Like when I'm doing these podcasts,
Your
I'm in
interlocutor.
conversation. I'm in
Yeah, yeah,
conversations because I'm not going to sort of pretend that I'm a journalist and I'm just asking questions. I'm in conversation. I'm just
yeah,
saying that because of what I've been saying and what I'll be saying now. You actually also, in talking about a genocidal sort of mindset, whether or not this is something that is performative, or something that the people that you're addressing believe they are, or is it that, or whether it's something that they want to do to be safe, and that is in effect genocidal. But you left out, or like you didn't address directly the demographic question, which is the main story, right? In
yeah,
terms of,
yeah.
I mean,
That's true.
the
I
whole
totally agree.
idea that demographically you need to maintain uh, parity, if not a majority, which requires structurally, logically, rationally, requires thinning down the population every once in a while, and causing people to creating a situation where life is unlivable, which is precisely what's been happening in Gaza
Yeah,
from day one. Nobody believes, at least nobody who is informed, believes that Israelis, just the Israeli state wanted to just kill everyone, because there are repercussions for something like that. But they want to make Gaza, the next best thing is to thin out Gaza and make it unlivable. This suboptimal was basically, and has been, and will continue to be, as we will witness, the policy. That is that requires measures that could be termed genocidal, whether in slow motion or intense, or in I don't know how to do the formulation. It's whether in slow motion, or whether it's in the kind of rate that we have been witnessing in the past two
accelerationist.
years.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. So,
yeah.
yeah, I mean, and this is not something that is hidden, or is difficult to get at, like you said, in terms of tweets, but also for people like me who have been following very closely for frankly decades, but the past 2 years it's been insane, because as a human being, when you wake up, that's what you think about, and before you sleep, that's what you think about, and the proximity of devices that allow you to learn more about what you care about is such that we're all always on. And if you follow Israeli media, and you probably know a lot more than I do, the several channels, 12, 13, 14. I started I know them now just like I know Lebanese channels, right?
Yeah,
Because and I know which one is like Netanyahu centric, and which ones
yeah,
can
is not.
be, critical on certain issues, but most are not critical on the question of Gaza. And if you translate or look at, some of the translations, it's ubiquitous, and it's also in the Israeli polls, and it's also in social media. It's also in young girls' middle school singing about literally annihilating
Yeah,
Palestinians. So it's so ubiquitous that, and it's always been ubiquitous. It's just that now, finally, Americans where we live are like, oh, wait a minute, what is it that we have not been looking at? And hence which is the next topic, hence the dramatic change. Dramatic, it's not a change, it's a dramatic change in public opinion in the United States. And it's only the tip of the iceberg if you consider how many people would like to move in this direction but cannot because there's a price that you pay.
yeah,
Just like living under any authoritarian regime,
certainly.
there's a price you pay to speaking out. So you are silent, but the silence has meaning as well. We have a very similar situation here, not least in universities where I work. I know personally so many people who would like to say certain things but will not because there's a cost. There's a cost with your chair, department chair, with the dean, with the president, with the university, and with some of your colleagues. And there's a cost if you want to change jobs, right? Or apply for other jobs. There's a huge cost. So what I'm saying is that there's this latent, tremendous critique of Israel that is, again, well, latent, right? It's not something that we're hearing. So yeah, it's so ubiquitous. It's not controversial to address it. And one of the reasons we're putting together this series is to ask in 2025, is this sustainable, and hence what is Israel's end game? So the next sort of before I get to the question of public opinion in the United States, can you share with us if you feel that there are any potentially emergent divisions on this question of whether this is sustainable in Israel within Israeli society? And I understand that there is a history for that, and then there's the moment of genocide, which is a couple of
Yeah,
years, 2 years now. So if you can also give us a historical view of what were these differences, and unfortunately for Israelis and the world, how these differences have sort of shrunk dramatically during the genocide. When people speak of things like the left or liberal Zionists, which I never really understood this term, and so on.
yeah, yeah, liberal racists. I've always been a bit more. Not actually, not always. I think in my early years, like maybe at 11 or 12, as a teenager, as a young child, I did see and I did have a lot more hope about the Israeli left. But I realized early on also that their solidarity with us is quite conditional. It needs it does not extend beyond the green line, or what they call the green line. It needs Israel to continue in its current form. And my father, for example, it's my second time citing him today. He'll be thrilled. Uh, uh, my father used to say that يعني they're protesting us being exiled from our houses in Jerusalem because they're sitting in our houses in Haifa, and they want to continue having our houses in Haifa to themselves. Yeah, and yet this the left that exists in Israel has kind of not vanished, but I think they all kind of were so super shocked by October 7th and traumatized by October 7th, and it created them to it's forced not forced them. It's kind of directed them to become a lot more in line with the state, a lot more aggressive, a lot more genocidal. Of course, إلا من رحم ربي, of course, there's going to be the activist or two or the three people who are actually anti-Zionist and actually incredibly anti-Zionist, but I'm talking about the institutions of the left. I'm talking about the leftist lawmakers. I'm talking about the leftist grassroots organizations, they have all turned more to the right. Maybe this is also, we cannot neglect the global the global trend of everybody turning towards the right in general, all around the world. But I think in Israel it has been significantly true. Now, my understanding of the Israeli state, um, my reading about the Oslo, for example, and what Israelis have done during the negotiations around Oslo, and like what kind of experts did they send around the negotiation table in Oslo? While the PA or the PLO sent politicians to Oslo, they also sent geographers and mappers and scientists and political economists and so on and so forth. So my understanding of the Israeli state is that they are keen to understand situations from multiple angles, and they are politically astute. And I think they will mutate. They understand that what the form in which Israel exists today is unsustainable. They understand that, maybe not diplomatically, but on a popular level, they have become a pariah state and a pariah people, and that they need to act accordingly. And this is where I'm a bit, hesitant to just say flat out that we won the media war, because maybe we won the media war in this round, but that does not mean that they're unable to read the room, to change course, and to change their scripts a little bit. And this is also why I'm a bit hesitant to just rely on racist or genocidal rhetoric coming out of Israelis' mouths. And I'm more keen to look at the policy, and more keen to look at the urban plans and so on. But I do think, Yani, if you're looking at different Israeli organizations, um, in Tel Aviv, there's now more of a tendency to condemn settler violence in the West Bank. There's more of a tendency to tokenize certain Palestinian voices. There's more of a tendency to, have symbolic, for lack of a better word, symbolic reparations, because they recognize, that this is not sustainable. Also, we see this in Zionist American organizations, which is also like equally as important. And I don't know what you think about this, but I'm seeing, the ADL for the first time in my life come out against Israeli settler mob attacks on Nablus, for example, and condemning. Or I'm seeing liberal Zionists or flat out Zionists condemning settler violence. There is now a new formula. If you're a hardcore Zionist, you're more flippant about the nature of Israel, and you're more like saying what you said pre-interview. No, you're more saying, no, uh, Israel's not perfect, but, and you're more willing to accept that there are flaws within the Israeli narrative. Or if you're someone who's trying to appear more liberal, you're trying to distinguish between what a good settler is and what a bad settler is. But on both ends of the spectrum, at the end of the day, you're still trying to rehabilitate Zionism, and in doing so, you're working to achieve Zionism's end goal, which is the complete and total erasure of the Palestinian people, or of the indigenous population in general. And the colonial, and we shouldn't exceptionalize. I think the colonial thinking is and has always been the same throughout history. And Israel, at the end of the day, is a colonial entity trying to do what colonies do, which is erase.
W- I want to go back to this, but do you mind? I want to go back to this because that's our next segment on public opinion. But before we do that, do you mind saying a few words about your book, Perfect Victims,
Yeah,
the
I don't mind.
nonfiction?
Yeah.
If you can share with us, for those who are not aware, it's a national bestseller, and it's really it's analytical and personal, and it was very well received. Can you tell us what is your argument in the book, and what kind of realities are you referring to, and what you mean by perfect victims, which is something that
Thank
we
you.
actually titled one of the articles we produced early on after October 7th to 2023 on Jadariya.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I was just about to say, no, by no means is it an original thesis or is it an original framework. I think what I've done with this book is taken what has always been an argument of the marginalized groups, be they the feminist movements of the world or like the Black liberation tradition or um, many different marginalized groups, and I've kind of taken a lens and I've applied it to Palestine and I've used Palestine specific contexts. I try to look at advocacy for Palestine from a bird's eye view, and I've established or kind of reaffirmed that what happens most of the time is that Palestinians are put on trial. Palestinians are constantly in cross examination, and instead of scrutinizing the occupier and the colonizer and the genocider, you're in fact scrutinizing their victims and demanding from their victims a specific, perfect, civilized script, a specific civilized conduct in order to say that you deserve, human rights and dignity and freedom and so on. And the ultimate thesis I'm saying here is that no matter what Palestinians do, and there is not a single thing that Palestinians or any other people do that means that they should be robbed of their human rights, of their dignity, and so on. So it's quite a basic argument, and yet even for me, when you apply it to real life situations, um, it can become a little tricky. And I found myself falling into lots of the traps that I criticize in the book, even while writing and even while writing it, like the overfixation on women and children, or the kind of like over editorialization of the brutality that Palestinians face, or the hyper individualism, and so on and so forth. But yeah, I was kind of frustrated with the discourse. I was frustrated that the Israelis and the Zionists are constantly setting the terms of engagement, and I wanted to contribute and engage in this way. And I think, yeah, again, this is nothing original, but I think I have a level of privilege because of Sheikh Jarrah and because of the Unity Uprising in 2021. I'm again privileged that lots of people listen to me and read what I'm writing. So I thought it would be good to kind of try as much as I can to raise the ceiling or like resituate people. And this is also directed not at people who don't know anything about Palestine, but it's directed about newcomers to the Palestinian movement, people who have the right sentiment, but don't know how to elevate their tactics a little bit more. And obviously, like I wrote it with the help of many, 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 many people, um, but I tried to make it as accessible as can be. Here's my elevator pitch for the book. We're on the 40th floor.
Absolutely. No, I'm glad you shared with us because the concept is very important, and it's something that we witness every day in the media, whereby the threshold is very different for Palestinians and Israelis in times of any, like, of course, always in times of hardship, but if there is an event or a violent attack, I mean, it's really remarkable how much you have to make an argument when it comes to Palestinians being victims, and how intuitive it is if, for instance, if Israelis are,
Yeah,
one can only think of the discourse around the rockets that
yeah,
Hamas would send. I mean, yeah, they are quote unquote rockets, but and mostly they you know traumatized people around Gaza. Uh, but you compare that trauma with some damage to property and maybe some injuries here and there. Even if we're talking about the death of someone here and there as well, you compare that to the policy of um, repression and the actual killing of
slaughter.
hundreds and thousands of people, uh, and they're often presented as, well, you have that and you have this, and that comes from the absolute lack or absence, actually, of an analysis of power, right?
Yeah,
Which, according to Sarah Hurwitz recently in an interview, it turns out that everything we've been trying to teach about power is actually uh, either incorrect or does not apply to Israel. Basically, the idea of the powerful has more of a
Yeah.
responsibility than the powerless, not least if they are able to control their entire livelihoods with a press of a button, including energy, water, borders, goods coming in and out, people coming in and out, and so on. Okay, so let me go to the next uh, question, which is based on your background, having lived in Palestine, and of course, I know you follow very meticulously what's going on now. What is the extent to which Israel slash Israelis pay attention to changing public opinion in the United States and Europe, which is essentially what many are saying. If the U.S. is, many have been saying for decades, so long as the U.S. is propping up Israel almost unconditionally, Israel is going to be okay. So now that this is actually changing at the level of public opinion, which will take a long time, if at all, to reach policy, how are Israelis viewing this change in public opinion? And uh, on the one hand, and does it make a difference to the political class? And I'm not saying does it make a difference today, because today is a very special moment in the past 2 years. But in the coming years, do these things make a difference to the political class more than social groups? And how do you see how they see this change in public opinion in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think in whatever change Israelis, whatever change in public opinion Israelis have been informed of, they have not been exposed to through their governments or through their media institutions, but they've been exposed to it through their own, you know, discovery and exploration. The Israeli media institutions at work today are increasingly and especially coddling of the population, and they treat people as though they are children, and they do everything they can to ensure that Israel's place in the world is still maintained, and Israelis are still beloved. But we are hearing more and more about Israelis, like, traveling around Europe and saying that they're from Malta instead of Israel to conceal the fact that they're Israeli. We are seeing Israeli generals, and each new cohort of the Israeli military presenting their what is it called, like their professional headshots. Only like they're facing backwards, and you're not seeing their faces. They're hiding. They're actively hiding their faces. So they certainly know that there's accountability in the works, no matter how minimal the scale, and they certainly know that they're not beloved in the world, to say the least. But the Israeli media institutions, Jewish American media institutions, the powers that be, yani, are, I think, irresponsibly using Holocaust trauma to say that this is what's happening today. The kind of popular accountability Israel and Israelis are facing is a replica of Holocaust trauma, or like the anti-Jewish oppression of the Second and the First World War. And so we're seeing articles titled like "Jews are in hiding again," and we're seeing like billionaire Zionists saying, I'm asking unironically, "Will you hide me?" and stuff like that. And I think this fear mongering is incredibly irresponsible on the part of mainstream Jewish institutions, because they are feeding and reinforcing this unhealthy understanding or unhealthy read of the world, in which they are without power, and in which they are prosecuted, and as though the scrutiny they're receiving worldwide is not due to the fact that they have just committed a flagrant genocide, a genocide so arrogant and so unabashed. Uh, it's, yeah, I think they're completely out of touch with reality.
In relation to this, we see billionaires, uh, supporters of Israel, invest in media institutions that are in the business of molding public opinion, both old and new, TikTok and CBS. Um, do you think it is naive to think that they can reverse? It's naive of them to think that they can reverse public opinion in the United States or public opinion trends, because there is a trend and it's moving by the week. That they can
Yeah.
influence this by injecting essentially the same propaganda that they have employed during a live stream genocide, especially in a context of heightened awareness among, I would say, the majority of Americans today as to what is going on in Israel. And again, just like when I asked you to leave aside the most extreme parts of Israeli society, even though some people would dispute the statement that I made, because it's much of it is considered extreme vis-a-vis
The
equality and
rest of the world.
Palestinians.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, to be fair, I guess,
Yeah.
if you we also are leaving aside, right, some of the extreme views here in the United States that are opposed to Israel, based on things other than equality, right, including racism and anti-Semitism and what have you. So is it, yeah? So is it naive to think that they can actually reverse public opinion trends?
Is it naive to think that they can reverse public opinion trends? Absolutely not. I think it's not naive at all. I think it's 100% within their wheelhouse. I think what is naive is the assumption and the belief, like you said, that they can reverse public opinion using the tactics that they have been using. I think they're out of touch with what the world is and where the world is now ideologically. They're out of touch with what how much the world has changed in the past 2 years, and so the tactics they've been using will certainly fail. And I do hope and pray that they continue using this the kind of like arrogant approach to diplomacy and arrogant approach to advocacy that has failed them miserably, that has almost been cartoonish. But yes, there is an irreversible stain, or like there's a kind of a really tough stubborn stain on Israel's legacy and Israel's place in the world today. However, I understand that, and maybe this is me being cynical, but I understand that the world's memory span is quite short, that people are fickle, where we notice this change in ideology to be on some part, I don't know what percentage, but to be on some part like, fueled by identity and fueled by tribalism. And it's not rooted, at least on some part, it's not rooted in, a profound change of one's politics and one's beliefs. And, like it's not that everybody that has witnessed um, the genocide unfold in Gaza has also actively sought out a political education that will make them anti-imperial, that will make them anti-capitalist, or that would make them anti-colonial, whatever. They're kind of people who are anti-slaughter, and you wonder what happens when the slaughter ceases. Um, yeah, because يعني مثلا, and maybe this is something you can tell me more about. But how I imagine there were moments of sympathy, there were moments of pro-Palestinian sentiment in the West, like after the Intifadas or like after certain wars on Gaza. And have these shifts been reversed? I believe so. Now, I'm not saying in any way, shape, or form that they're gonna re recuperate and like rebuild themselves and like polish their image and start from zero again. But I'm saying we just cannot rely on the fact that we won a media war today. We cannot rely on the moral arc of the universe bending towards justice, because we have to be more active in our fight against this. Now, luckily, I think maybe luckily in some capacity, and unfortunately in other capacities, but I think the world at large is losing faith in corporate media and in mainstream media, and so by default that's a weakness. But if they continue to control social media platforms, we have a big problem.
Uh, yes, I do think, to answer your question, I do think that they're different. After the Intifada, especially the first one, and then after the 2014 invasion of Gaza, uh, which was, I think, a turning point in the US and in general, sort of a turning point. There was sympathy. We even saw it, even Jake Tapper, well, he was different, a little different then, and others were saying things that they had never said before in terms of the aggregate, right? In terms of a number of speakers, journalists, and so on.
Yeah.
The Washington Post and New York Times, after 2014, started publishing, or at least you started seeing more views on Palestine that did not toe the line of the US policy and Israel's behavior. You started seeing more and more writers and authors being invited to corporate media. We're talking about corporate media, mainstream media.
Yeah.
But the scale, brutality of the slaughter that Israel is visiting on Gaza and Palestinians in the past 2 years, it's incessant repetition on a daily basis. And in my view, the thing that sort of I, that incenses or that creates a kind of I don't know, a certain kind of response in what might be called a liberal society was the collective punishment in terms
Yeah.
of starvation and the question
Yeah.
of children and babies
Yeah.
being killed, starved, mutilated. Those sorts of things, I think, are different than the spikes in sympathy for
Yeah.
Palestinians. This movement today, and I would have to say that, and I'm not, as you know, I'm not a Palestine researcher, but I've lived Palestine since I was born,
Yeah.
from my home, and my surroundings, and my research in general. Um, I think the difference is that the sympathy that was uh, on display in previous events by Americans was sympathy towards Palestinians, and that was kind of it. Today, the sympathy is much larger, but I don't think that's what's going to move the needle. It's actually learning more about what Israel is and has been doing
Yeah.
by way of structure, by way of a systematic policy. I think this is what is new, number one. Number two, um, I think that this moment in the United States is a different moment than 1988, 2000, 2008, 9, 2012,
Yeah.
2014, 2018, 2021, even. Because I'm
Yeah.
counting the times when
Yeah. Yeah.
Israel was mowing the lawn and so on in Gaza. This genocide coincides with a downward spiral in the United States that is unprecedented at a time where the world is moving from the US unipolar sort of dominance towards a multipolar world, at a time when also Americans are not uh, enjoying the fruits of empire as prior. And it also coincides with serious cultural wars, differences within the United States. The pie is getting smaller, the stakes are getting bigger,
Yeah.
and the America First movement uh, is recognizing, however you might want to critique parts of it, and I
Yeah.
completely disagree with those people who want to be so radical politically and analytically that they say they're all the same. They're not all the same.
No, of
If you
course
say they're
not.
all the same, you're not being a strategic human. You're being
It's
a
myopic.
purist who's
It's myopic
completely,
to say it's all the same.
going to be sidelined in the real world.
Yeah.
But no matter how you see the America First movement, uh, it is setting its sights on the other side, which is the Israel First, whether or not Trump is in that camp 100%, because I believe, like many others, that Trump is not Biden. He's not ideologically committed to Israel. There are other
I
things
agree.
at play. So, uh, yeah, that's where I stand on this, and that's why I do believe that it is naive to think that you can completely reverse things, but it is not unthinkable to stop the needle from continuing to move, and reversing it a little bit, but not completely. And we are seeing this as a result. Like we talked, you and I talked a little bit before this broadcast about uh, supporters of Israel trying to perform realism, that hey, Israel is just another state, so it's not flawless, and so on and so forth,
Yeah,
and avoiding the the most model army. Are you fucking serious? I mean, I mean, it took like
it's
several
not.
decades to come to this realization that saying this is absurd, right? Given the history, but also there's been a shift from defending Israel to going on the offense on Islam and Muslims, which is
Yeah,
a distraction, and so on. So yes, I do think that it's going to be a challenge, a huge challenge, and it's almost like the more you propagandize for Israel, the more you're turning people off.
yeah. So I certainly agree with that assessment, and I think like I would be remiss, like you mentioned Israel first and America first. I would be remiss if I didn't mention how deeply unpopular APAC is becoming, and you have politicians kind of betting on saying that they're APAC free, that being kind of a political some kind of political leverage. So that's really really promising, but at the same time, it does not mean that maybe APAC can adopt something else. Maybe instead of being supported by PACs, politicians are going to be maybe more subdued in their Zionism and supported by individual wealthy donors and uh, individuals instead of PACs. And they'll be maybe again more quiet on Israel, more quiet in their Zionism, but still loyal to Israel. I'm just saying, of course, there is an irreversible stain, and yet they're also capable of playing a dirty game, of being sleuths and finding a way around it. And I just don't want, and this is certainly not what you're suggesting, but I don't want anyone to just kind of kick their feet up and say it's going to fix itself in the end, or again the moral arc of the universe is just going to bend towards our freedom, because we have to be actively involved in that process of history making if we want anything to change.
Oh shit! Now you depressed me because I was thinking, khalas, after 10 points extra in terms of being supportive of Palestinian rights, we can just go home. The occupation and
That's
apartheid will
surely what
unravel.
I
No, I mean,
mean.
look,
You've been doing this a lot longer than me, but I know I think I'm gonna, at 50, I think it's خلاص. If it's not free, I don't, I'm gonna go somewhere else.
good thing I didn't believe that when I was your age. Um, So no, I do think that it's not reversible in complete form. I do
Yeah,
believe that it is reversible in partial form
I agree.
if they pursue a certain approach. And then my caveat is even the critics of Israel and the movement of the needle in the polls is not a function of recognizing the humanity of Palestinians as much as being repulsed by Israel. Whether or not this revulsion has, ulterior motives like anti-Semitism, the overwhelming majority are not. And
Yeah,
and the overwhelming majority are actually Islamophobic, the ones who have actually changed.
yeah,
So it's so funny that we nothing about being racist against Arabs and being Islamophobic is meaningful. It's all like it's sunk cost. But if there is one person who's anti-Semitic, then they kind of equal the tens of millions that are
yeah,
already Islamophobic, and how they are practicing and performing their Islamophobia in the mainstream as the norm.
yeah.
So that's
And
that's
it's policy. It's like the Islamophobia also is policy driven. Yeah, and a lot of the people say that there's anti-Semitic incidents on the rise, and sure, there can be like there possibly could be an uptick in like anti-Semitic rhetoric, but there is not any anything in U.S. policy or in U.S. institutions that shows any example of systemic or strategic or policy backed anti-Semitism, when Islamophobia on the opposite is the complete, it's the kind of the complete norm. You're expected to accept Islamophobia. You're expected to accept the racist characterization of Arabs as terrorists and the racist characterizations of us as violent and as genocidal and would want to kill all Jews and blah blah blah. These are things you just take business as usual, and yet the world needs to stop at the first anti-Semitic accusation. It's important again to have a power analysis, like you said earlier. It's important to say, even if there is like a percentage, a very small, I would argue, very small percentage of the sentiment that is fueled by anti-Semitism, the sentiment of anti-Semitism does not and will not equate to the weight of real bombs and real slaughter happening in real time. And that is my priority, is stopping the slaughter. And that should be everybody's priority, because that slaughter and life and death comes long before discourse.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that contrast, I mean, says it all. My point is to emphasize that this shift is not rooted in humanizing Palestinians
No, it's
or
about their
in the
own
question
interest.
of equality. It's actually rooted. I mean, it's rooted in many things, to be sure, but much of it is also this disbelief and revulsion at the actions of Israel. At the same time that we're having trouble here at home, as is said, and at the same time we're helping Israel fight its wars now and prior, and people now are unearthing why we actually went to war. We didn't go to war. We invaded Iraq and sent it back centuries in 2003. So people are going back to that. Those people who did not actually have that position earlier are now going back to that. And in terms of the uptick, there is definitely an increase in the rate of anti-Semitic discourse, for sure, because you can see it on YouTube. You can see it. It's real, but it's still, compared to the normalization of Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism. Um, they're oceans apart,
Yeah,
empirically and otherwise. And I have to say, I'll just say this because it's important. The stock of Islamophobia, besides the fact that the term is completely mild and kind of like, it's like dog phobia. It doesn't, it's compared to other terms like anti-Semitism, it's very light. I mean, it's not just phobia; it's much more than that.
yeah,
Besides that, there's also a conflation of Islamophobia with anti-Arab racism, because Islamophobia is not actually, when people are Islamophobic, they're not really thinking about Indonesians and Nigerians, who are probably the largest populations of Muslims
yeah,
in a single place, at least relatively speaking.
yeah,
They're thinking about Arabs. It's almost like Arabs, whether they're Muslims or not, or Arabs
yeah,
whether they are believers or not, like Muslim believers or Muslim non-believers, which we have tens of millions of in the Arab world, whether or
yeah,
not they are publicly professing it on YouTube every day or Facebook. It's just the truth. uh,
yeah,
but there is this shunning of the anti-Arabness, right? Because it's uh, uh, you know in fact, people like Farid Zakaria have popularized, may God not bless him. Uh,
curse him.
Immediately, I started believing in God when I talk about Farid Zakaria, when he basically made a distinction between Muslim Arabs and non-Arab Muslims. And he basically said the problem is with the Muslims that
Arabs.
are actually Arab, and the terrorism and so on, keeping aside completely like all the facts of policy and foreign policy and empirical developments in the actual Arab Middle East, as opposed to America's positions vis-a-vis Malaysia, Indonesia, and
Yeah,
Nigeria, and other Muslim majority countries. Okay. No, this discussion is I think also relevant to the question of what Israel will do. And the last dimension of this that I'd like to share with you or ask you about is the question of what is Israel's end game. uh, how can there be in your mind, as somebody who is like viscerally connected to these topics a lot more than most of us who are just opining here, um, how can there be an end game Israel in the presence or in its in the context where it possesses nuclear weapons? And we're not talking about an end game as the racist supporters of Israel's assume. The end game is not about the human who is a Jew, Israeli Jew. The end game is about dismantling the apartheid structure. It's like dismantling Nazism in Germany, not killing every German, or dismantling apartheid in South Africa, not killing every white Afrikaans, a member
Yeah,
of the white supremacist groups. So, in terms of Israel's endgame as a supremacist ethno state, how can that ever come about given its possession of nuclear weapons? I mean, yeah, I have
it's
nowhere
a
to go with that.
terrifying. It's a very, very terrifying prospect to think about. It's it's very, very scary to think about. My knee-jerk reaction, or kind of my impulse, is to say that they wouldn't use it, but I also believe that they wouldn't bomb, um, you know, bomb hospitals hundreds of times. I thought they wouldn't kill as many journalists as they have. So they've repeatedly crossed the threshold, really, like, kicked the threshold. And so, is it out of the question? Will they use it in the final throes of their dying state? Uh, maybe it's a really terrifying question. I think what consoles me, and what you know allows me to think about it a little bit more rationally, is the understanding that, as precise as they try to be with nukes, it's hard for it not to be harmful for them as well. It's I don't think they can just like select the Palestinian towns to nuke them without actually affecting their own populations, especially because George Bush said it many decades ago, when he said that the Palestinian state looks like Swiss cheese. But yeah, I mean, so much of Palestine, except for the Gaza Strip, and now actually parts of the Gaza Strip, parts of the
Bush
Gaza Strip.
daddy, not the son, right?
No, the son. He
The
said
son.
that. Yeah, he said that we deserve a state that doesn't look like Swiss cheese. But it does look exactly like Swiss cheese, in the sense that there is settlements and outposts everywhere you look on the map. You cannot turn your head without finding a hill with a settlement on it. So, like, nukes on Palestine might uh, fully eradicate them as well. That is not to rule out that they could use nukes against Iran, and then Iran might retaliate, and يعني bye bye سلامتك. But yeah, what do you think? I'm curious to know what
I
you
know
think.
I don't know. I mean, I have been involved in these conversations for decades. Basically, that fascism and structural racism at the level that we witness in Palestine by Israel is not sustainable, right?
Yeah,
So just like fascist Italy and Nazi Germany were not sustainable because
yeah,
of the utter inhumanity and barbarism of what that requires. But this has been sustainable.
yeah,
Now we are beginning to see that, as many have been saying, historians, whether it's Israeli historians who are sort of, not uh, gung ho on Zionism, or Israeli historians that are severely critical of Zionism, like Ilan Pappe, are addressing the last episode or phase of Zionism. But my question comes at this moment, with the possession of nuclear weapons in the hands of people like, I mean, any prime minister of Israel. It's not like Labor prime ministers have been gentle; they have been actually some
yeah,
of the worst.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and I'm not even talking about Ben Gvir and Smotrich, right? I mean, Netanyahu is uh, can fill in and so on, and be the person I'm referring to right now. nuclear weapons in the hands of uh, decision makers of this variety, I mean, is a difficult makes the question of dismantling racism in Israel, Palestine, or the racism of the Israeli state. Uh, it just makes it a different kind of question, right? Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, one of the
it's
reasons the Americans, we as in
yeah,
America, invaded in a barbaric and horrible manner the state of Iraq in 2003 is because we knew that Saddam didn't have weapons when in fact we invaded on the pretext that he did have, sorry,
yeah,
weapons of mass destruction.
yeah,
So what I'm saying is that this is a very important component, and I don't know what the answer is. I do think that societal implosion is more likely to take place in Israel as a result of various forms of difficulties, from economic to demographic to the question of Israel no longer, and I've been talking about this since we started having these conversations after October 7th. Israel is no longer a safe haven for Jews, which is one of the main raison d'etre of Israel, at least the professed ones.
yeah,
In fact, migration is now reversed, and
yeah.
one wonders, even in 2 years, besides the ones who do it for ideological reasons, purely ideological reasons, who in their right mind would leave for good New Jersey? Actually, I'm not going to use that state. Who would leave, you know, I don't know, North Carolina
Yeah,
or California to go live in Tel Aviv, or anywhere else in the state of Israel. So yeah, I don't have an answer, but I do think that it's going to be societal, and
yeah,
unfortunately, as long as we have this sort of um, administration or a democratic administration, because in my view, Biden was worse.
yeah. I agree.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure how things are going to change in the short to medium run. We do know that in the long run, demographic changes in the United States and basically the different political orientation of younger people in the United States will have ramifications globally, in my view, with the attendant
Yeah,
fact that other younger generation elsewhere are different than my generation. Like your generation and the younger generation than yours even are quite different from ours. So, but in the long run, we're all dead, as the rational choice theorists say. So, yeah. Muhammad, I want to ask you one last question before you leave. You talked about if supporters of Israel adopt certain approaches and tactics regarding propaganda and so on, they might actually reverse, the trend. Uh, what would you advise supporters of Israel to use as a tactic to change people's minds about Israel's genocide?
I, I don't think I want to do any free consulting, but the
Yeah, but
idea of
even if you even if it's not free, and even if, I mean, is there anything? I mean, what? Yeah, I mean, I keep thinking about this, and I keep thinking about earlier forms of fascism and racism and ethno states and apartheid. What would the white population in South Africa? What could it have done to actually reverse public opinion by the late 80s and early 1990s
I don't know
globally?
about I don't know about South Africa because they were also faced with the economic sanctions and with the kind of like isolation and diplomatic isolation. I hope that Israel faces this sooner than later, but I think there is a way for them to make. I need to find the perfect word here, but yani, for lack of a perfect word, I think there is a way for them to be backhanded about all of this. There is a way for them to have like declared positions that are, anti-occupation or anti-apartheid or anti, maybe not maybe not so far, maybe not anti-apartheid or anti-occupation, but anti-violence or anti-settler violence or whatever, all the while maintaining that settler violence in the grand scheme of things. I just think, yes, again, there is irreversible damage that's done um, to the Israeli state, but that doesn't mean that there cannot be a new movement that emerges that's like more ethical or purports to be
But that would be great if there is an ethical movement that would recognize
yeah,
the
it would be a win-win.
asymmetry,
Yeah, of
inequality,
course.
and so on.
Yeah, it would, it would, yeah, even in its attempt to rehabilitate Zionism, a kind of ethical movement will serve in our advantage in the end of the day. But I think this is it can, and maybe this is like for a different conversation, because it can be reductive, focusing on race. But I think the difference between Nazi Germany and fascist Italy is the race element, and I think they have been able to do what they have been able to do to us for so long is because, like you said earlier, we are Arabs. And I think a better example to study, or not a better example, but like a complementary example to study, would be Algeria. Of course, we look at Algeria and we look at like it in the context of a dying colonial order in general all around the world. We look at it also in terms of like the resistance, the popular resistance and the armed resistance of the Algerian people. But one aspect that's often neglected is the French elite's public divorce with colonialism in Algeria. And I think that needs to be what happens here, particularly on the part of Jewish institutions in the United States, particularly on the part of Jewish institutions like elsewhere. That isn't to say that Jews are the sole culprit in this fight. And they're certainly, when we're talking about numbers, they are certainly outnumbered by evangelical Christians and evangelical Zionists. But that does not negate the fact that they are the protagonist of this conflict, for lack of a better word. And as long as there is no public divorce with Israel from American Jewish life, I think it's going to continue to reign.
And it's noteworthy to say that American Jewish life is experiencing dramatic changes, also
Certainly.
demographically, between Zionist parents and their children. It's so ubiquitous that it is one of the main talking points in community centers. And the reason we know this is because a lot of these conversations are public and they're open. And this horror at seeing your son and daughter speaking, in using terms, international law terms, and ICJ terms. I mean, and
Yeah.
imagine they're horrified at their
Yeah.
children using international law, not basically, Hamas propaganda, if you will. So, no, this is definitely happening. And the reason I'm asking this really cynical and odd question in terms of what could be recommended to supporters of Israel to change the narrative back to what it was or in that direction is because I'm just thinking about as something very interesting that Hassan Haj shared with us, and that is, despite the difficulty and the horror of the moment, the unending evisceration of life by Israel in Gaza, if given that populations live in that small piece of land, you know, there must be a horizon, and the question is the horizon going to come from arguments, or as you said, movements, or movements inside Israel, so to speak, or arguments inside Israel or among Israel supporters, or from movements outside Israel itself, right? Like in the United States,
Yeah.
because now we're seeing that the old approach to supporting Israel by certain social forces in the United States is failing miserably, and it's causing schisms that have ramifications for American political futures. But on the other side, also, I would like to suggest that we don't talk very much about what Arab states can do, because they are extremely not just impotent or complicit; they are partners in in
Yeah.
in, in the slaughter. So I don't even use the word complicit. Um, but in terms of the Arab street, that is also beholden and not beholden but subjugated, but also in terms of Palestinian reconstruction of certain organizations or building new organizations within the Palestinian polity. I mean, that is also another, uh, you know, uh, another engine that we don't talk about very much, especially in times
Yeah,
of genocide. This is very difficult. So, so the question is really, where would change come from in either direction? And I'm putting this to you as I'll be putting it to other people in the series, because there must be a horizon. And the reason we
yeah,
are seeking a horizon is precisely because we do not think like those people who say we are trying to eliminate human beings by saying free Palestine or from the
yeah,
river to the sea, as opposed to recognizing that this is all about a struggle for equality and
yeah,
dignity and something that is most basic. Not the whole idea that we're saying this is because we're against the elimination of the other, like the other side is trying to eliminate Palestinians.
yeah.
Um, anyway, so yeah, any thoughts on
Yeah,
where this
it's
change can come from?
yeah. I mean, I tend to think, it should come from the mothership. Yeah, I think it should come from the United States. Yeah. Of course, that isn't to say that everybody else is off the hook. There's certainly like an ecosystem. There needs to be like popular uprising in Palestine. There needs to be struggle against um, the PA and other oppressive authoritarian regimes in the Arab world. But we also know that here in the United States, as difficult as things are getting, and as reminiscent of fascism, Donald Trump is being, and as ICE is sweeping people off the floor, there still is a breathing room in the United States that does not exist in Egypt or Jordan, for example. People are being swept up the streets for just standing in the middle of a square and holding up the Palestinian flag. People are being disappeared into dungeons for saying something about Palestine or something critical of their own local governments. People in the Arab world, especially like when I listen to Arab podcasts, so I'll to listen to like Arab news. A lot of the time, Palestinians and others, not just Palestinians, but Palestinians and others will say, look at the Europeans, look at the Americans, how they are marching in the hundreds of thousands. Meanwhile, we are not marching. But what they tend to neglect to mention, yani, and maybe this is out of just sheer not knowing, but is that most of the protests here in the US are licensed. People seek permits for protests, and it's not that Americans are out of their own volition, yani, protesting for Palestine. It's the Palestinian and Arab people, the activist class that has been exiled from Egypt and Jordan due to the authoritarianism that are organizing these protests, that are organizing these movements. It's a kind of a difficult layer to contend with. But yani, we have there's no political prospect. Maybe prospect is not the word, but there's not currently any kind of political organizing happening in Egypt or in Jordan or in any of those other countries that would be promising. And it is happening here. And this isn't to say, we should only focus on the US, but I do believe it's the most important frontier and continues to be the most important frontier. And I think the odds of Palestinians defeating the PA is a lot larger and a lot more believable than the odds of like Egyptians defeating Sisi, for example, or the police state in Egypt. But to say one last thing, عشان يعني to end on a moment of hope, and for me also because I do believe that you have to be optimistic, and it's a political obligation to be optimistic. I do think what we have seen in the past 2 to 3 years is unprecedented, and the kind of sentiment you are experiencing all around the world is also unprecedented. I just fully believe that we have to continue to be as active as we were during the genocide. Now, as it fizzles out or as it becomes more incremental, in order to affect real change. But certainly, it is a damage that Israelis are dealing with a damage that is certainly irreversible.
Thank you so much, Muhammad. I'm also motivated by some of the things you shared, and I recognize the role of the U.S. And I recognize that people on the side of equality and freedom and Palestine liberation, you know, are are going to pull their weight more in the future. It's
Yeah.
interesting that we didn't even mention the PA except once this last moment. You mentioned the PA because no, don't get me started. But also note that on the other side, uh, supporters of Israel in the United States more recently than before, are beginning to talk openly about the importance of decreasing U.S. aid to Israel gradually, so that Israel is not completely reliant on the United States. Because precisely they are concerned about the opposite of what you said, the counterfactual of what you said. That if the U.S. is the decider, then Israel should basically disentangle slowly, gradually, because it will fall apart if it does so very quickly, while finding other ways to survive and other
Yeah.
sources of
Yeah.
support. People like Josh Hammer and others have been, vocal. I mean, one can be cynical and say they don't mean it or what have you, but that's it's I think there's something more behind this idea of trying to protect the longevity of Israel from their side by saying that yes, me too, I am opposed to I am for reducing aid to Israel, except I would like to do it gradually, and this came up in several debates and conversations that many of us have been witnessing. um, all right. Well, Muhammad, we spent a longer time than I thought, but I'm glad that we did because I wanted
Me
to
as
address
well.
this with somebody like yourself, who is unlike me. I mean, despite the fact that I've been going to Palestine since before you were born. Sorry to disappoint you. Um, and I'm assuming you're of a certain age, yani.
Yeah, just a few years younger.
So and somebody who's been actually following this. I'm not like you. I mean, for me, it's I'm not even a Palestine researcher. But speaking with you is illuminating because you actually viscerally experienced, living in Palestine, living under military occupation, and yet in your answers and like when you were saying, would Israelis use nuclear weapons if it's at the last moment when to avoid being dismantled. I do appreciate how, despite the humiliation and the repression and the trampling on your dignity, like you were wondering whether they may or may not, because there must be some humanity, which is very, very interesting. And one can contrast that approach of yours in this particular situation to so many tens of millions of people in the West that are scared that Iran, if they get a nuclear weapon, they will immediately use it against everybody else.
Yeah.
There's no hesitation, right?
Yeah.
And I'll let people think about what that means. Um, all right. Well, um,
Thank
m-
you. It's really a pleasure and an honor, yani, and I'm glad this is a long time coming. I'm glad I got to think about these things with
me
you.
too, Habibi. The honor is mine, and very happy to continue speaking with you. And all power to you.
Thanks.
We will be in touch.
Yalla, see you soon. Take care.
Salam.
Thank you.